This is another in my series of occasional lectures at WJC on comparative criminal law and procedure, my first virtual one, and hopefully my last. This time I want to compare how New York law and Jewish law define the crimes of bribery and bribe receiving. Under New York law, a public servant commits the crime of bribe receiving when he or she solicits, accepts, or agrees to accept any benefit from another person upon an agreement or understanding that his or her vote, opinion, judgment, action, decision, or exercise of discretion as a public servant will thereby be influenced. A public servant includes any public officer or employee of the state or of any political subdivision of the state. And a benefit is broadly defined to include any gain or advantage to the beneficiary. Under this definition, a benefit need not be monetary or even constitute property. Examples of benefits other than money and property have included sexual favors and an agreement not to run against a candidate in a primary. In order to constitute a bribe, the action for which the bribe is paid need not be illegal or improper in and of itself. A bribe paid to do the right thing is still a bribe. There must be, though, a quid pro quo, to use a phrase we all heard a lot of last year. That is what the law calls an agreement or understanding between the parties that the benefit will influence the action of the public servant. Now let's take a look at Jewish law. The prohibition against receiving a bribe appears in several places in the Torah, most prominently in Deuteronomy, when God directed Moses to set up judges and officials for yourself in all your cities that the Lord your God is giving you and for your tribes. God directed the judges not to pervert justice, not to show favoritism, and not to take a bribe, warning that bribery blinds the eyes of the wise and perverts just words. That is, it diverts a judge from rendering a fair judgment. God then concluded with the famous line, "Justice, justice shall you pursue." A similar prohibition against bribe receiving appears in Exodus, where God similarly commands, "You shall not accept a bribe, for a bribe will blind the clear-sighted and corrupt words that are right." So there's a major distinction between the American view of justice and the Torah's view of judges. For us, when justice is blind, it's good. But for the Torah, when judges are blind, it's bad. It's clear from another verse in Deuteronomy that today's concern about wrongful convictions in the United States is not new. Since Moses there warned the Jewish people, "Cursed be he who takes a bribe to put an innocent person to death." Refraining from accepting bribes is indeed godlike, since in yet another verse in Deuteronomy, Moses announced to the Jewish people that, and I quote, "The Lord of the Lords, the great, mighty, and awesome God, will show no favor, nor will he take a bribe." While there is no explicit prohibition in the Torah against paying a bribe as there is against receiving one, Maimonides and other authorities make clear that the bribe giver has sinned as well. He's just committed a different sin. The bribegiver sin, Maimonides says, is a violation of the commandment in Leviticus not to place a stumbling block before the blind. So in fact, when a person bribes a judge, not only does he place a stumbling block before the judge, but as the Torah repeatedly tells us, it blinds the judge as well. The Talmud, Rashi, and Maimonides all discuss the sin of bribe receiving only in the context of bribes received by a judge. But as under New York law, it is a sin when committed by other public officials as well. The passage in Deuteronomy that I quoted earlier prohibits bribe receiving not only by shoftim, that is by judges, but by shotrim as well. Rashi explains that shotrim were those who enforced the judge's verdicts. And the commentary in the Stone Chumash adds that shotrim would also circulate in the markets and streets to enforce standards of honesty and summon violators to the court for adjudication. Prophets who complained about bribery aimed their criticism not only at judges, but also at kings and other non-judicial officials. Isaiah, just to name one, cried out, "Thy princes are rebellious and companions of thieves. Everyone loves bribes and follows after rewards." In fact, according to the late Menachem Elon, an Israeli Supreme Court judge and law professor, the halakha applies the prohibition against bribery not only to judges, but to any person discharging a public function who is in a position to adopt decisions that may either harm or benefit the bribe giver. And like under New York law, Maimonides says that the prohibition against receiving a bribe applies not only to the bribe of money, but a bribe of all things. The Talmud teaches that even a bribe of words is forbidden, and it offers numerous examples of non-monetary bribes. One involved a man who offered a judge named Samuel assistance crossing a river. When the man told Samuel that he had a pending lawsuit, Samuel immediately disqualified himself from acting as a judge in the man's case. Similarly, another judge disqualified himself from hearing the lawsuit of a man who had removed a bird from the judge's head. And yet another judge disqualified himself from hearing the case of a man who had covered some saliva the judge had spit out on the ground. Rabbi Ishmael, son of Rabbi Yossi, demonstrated just how far he was prepared to go to avoid being influenced by a benefit. Rabbi Ishmael had a tenant gardener who paid him with a basket of fruit once a week, always on Fridays. But once the tenant brought the basket on a Thursday, and Rabbi Ishmael asked him why. When the tenant explained that he had a pending lawsuit, Rabbi Ishmael both disqualified himself as a judge in the case and refused to take the fruit. Later, Rabbi Ishmael thought to himself that if he was worried about the effect of accepting the fruit that he refused but was entitled to, how much more would a judge who actually accepted a bribe be influenced by it? Like New York law, Talmudic law does not limit bribery to payments made for actions that are in and of themselves unjust or unlawful. As Maimonides puts it, the command against receiving a bribe applies not only when the judge's intent is to pervert judgment, but it is forbidden even for the purpose of vindicating the just and holding liable the one who should in fact be held liable. On the other hand, the requirement in New York's bribery laws for a quid pro quo between the bribe giver and bribe receiver does not exist in Jewish law. Instead, the Talmud assumes that, as a matter of human nature, a payment would influence the judge, even if the judge did not accept it with a corrupt understanding, and even if the judge didn't recognize the unconscious effect it could have on his decision. As Rashi puts it, as soon as the judge accepts the bribe, it is impossible for him not to be favorably disposed toward the bribe giver and decide the judgment in his favor. In the Talmud, Rabbah explains that a judge is prohibited from accepting a gift from a litigant because as soon as the judge receives it, he becomes as one with the man, and no man sees himself in the wrong. The rabbis of the Talmud described other effects of bribe receiving beyond corruption, cautioning that even a great sage who takes bribes will not depart from the world without being afflicted by a dullness of the mind. Rashi describes even more dramatic consequences, warning that even if one is wise in Torah, if he accepts a bribe, he will not only lose his eyesight, but he will eventually become deranged, and perhaps even worse, forget his studies. It is not only judges and other public servants who must steer clear of bribes. As Rabbi Zelig Pushkin reminds us in a book called Love Your Neighbor, we are all judges, we all judge the actions of others. And when we are called upon to judge, whether in our work or in our personal lives, perhaps we need not worry too much if the person we are judging did whatever the modern day equivalent is of helping us cross a river, removing a bird from our heads, or covering up our spittle. But as the rabbis of the Talmud understood, we are all susceptible to bribery, unconsciously, if not consciously, even by mere words of flattery. As the rabbis may or may not have also understood, we are also susceptible to other forms of prejudice, like implicit or unconscious bias. May we all resist the temptations, both overt and subtle, and the dangers, both conscious and unconscious, to make the judgments in our lives unfairly. And may we all judge others as we would have them judge us. Shabbat Shalom.